Hey, Jerry, thank you so much. Such an honor having you here on the podcast, the xMonks Drive. How have you been today?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a delight. It's an honor. We had a little bit of back and forth before the recording officially started. I was like, oh, kindred spirit. Oh, two souls. Got it. So that made me happy. I am well. My body is good. My heart is good. Um, Today is my daughter's 29th birthday. Um, uh, which just makes me very, very happy. Even though she's in New York and I'm here in Colorado, so there's a 2 hour time difference. We've already been texting, and she sent me gorgeous photos of the beautiful day there. So that all makes me happy. So I am well. I am happy. I am rested. I may be a little groggy because it's still a little early here, but other than that, I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing very well. The day started really well. Uh, I had a couple of coaching conversations, went really well. Uh, did my exercise, that went really well after a week's time because we had our festival season here going on.
Oh, Diwali.
Yeah, Diwali.
Diwali. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Happy
Yeah.
Diwali.
Thank you. You too.
Belatedly.
Thank you.
Mm.
And then I was going through your book, and every time when I go through your book, I fall in love with that. I've read this book, Reboot Leadership and the Art of Growing Up, at least a couple of times. And Jerry, let me just mention something here for you. The day I read your book, from that day onwards, I started taking this one simple question: how are you? To the core. Because before this book, this question was just a cliched question. How are you? I'm fine. How are you? I'm doing very well. And that's it. And in that book, when you ask, how are you actually? It did make a lot of difference to me. So
Yeah, isn't
thank
it
you.
extraordinary? You're welcome.
Absolutely, it
It's
is.
extraordinary. I do a lot of public talks, and the joke I make at the start of the talk is there's been a lot written about the fact that I make people cry. And then I very dramatically throw up a slide and I say, "You want to know how I make people cry?" I ask them one question: "How are you?" And everybody laughs at that point. And I then explain that it's an act of radical inquiry to actually ask that question with love and kindness and empathy and presence. And behind the cliche that you identified, "How are you? I'm fine," or "How are you? I'm busy," right? Which are the two answers I get all the time. Behind that is a call to stop, slow down, be present, be real. All these things that you and I may speak about to clients, to friends, the teachings that we have gathered from those who came before us, the teachers who are before us. Oh, be mindful. Well, what the hell does that mean? It actually means something as simple as saying, how am I? I'm not well, but I'm too busy to take care of myself. Whoa, stop right there. Why? Well, you don't understand. If I actually slow down and experience my life, tears may come. Well, maybe it's time to listen to those tears so that the next time you slow down and answer the question, how are you? You can say, I'm excited that it's my daughter's 29th birthday. It
Wow.
was a long little riff. Sorry about that.
No,
I
I
just
just
started having coffee. So
I just loved it when you said the radical inquiry because I've heard about radical compassion or radical acceptance. And when I read about that word radical inquiry, where I just need to slow down and reflect on what's actually going on, how am I? It opened up
Mm.
a new world for myself that I was not even aware of.
Well, I appreciate you're making that connection. For me, the act of compassion, inculcating compassion, begins with that self check in. Right? If we think about compassion, we can respond to compassion sympathetically, right? I can look at you and I can say, "Oh, what a difficult life you have," and I am separate from it. And that can engender all sorts of distrust and power dynamics. But when compassion is really rooted in empathy, as we were joking before the recording, your story is my story is your story. Compassion is based in empathy. It creates a connection, it creates a bridge. But you cannot build an empathetic connection without self awareness, right? Being aware of your past, being aware of your present state, even connecting to your ruminations and anxieties about the future. So that's why that simple little question, how are you, asked with the right angle, with the right perspective, is radical. And the second half of that is that we are socialized to think that asking the question, how am I feeling, is selfish, self indulgent. But here again, if we think about conflicts, you maybe have a conflict with your life partner. And they come in and they make a statement that just incenses you. You have a choice in that moment. You can say, how am I? Well, I'm actually not capable of responding from my adult self. So I'm going to say that. And I'm going to come back to a moment in time when we can come back together. So again, more long-windedness from Jerry, but it's I find it quite radical.
It is. It is. Such a pleasure talking to you, Jerry. In just 5 minutes, I can find myself. I can feel myself so grounded. Also, because the very first time when I read your book, I fell in love with that book.
Oh, thank you.
And, you know, you have shared your life in this book with such grace, dignity, and vulnerability. Would love for you to share how has your childhood impacted and helped you become the person and the leader that you are today?
You want me to reveal the secrets of the book, then nobody will go out and buy the book. I think the simplest way to answer that question would be to look at the effects that the chaos of my childhood had on the adult that I am today. So, and it still reverberates now, even though I can project this calm demeanor. You don't want to know what's going on inside. Just kidding. So as a boy, I tell the story of the fact that, like many people, my parents were challenged. My mother was diagnosed shortly before I was born with a mental illness called schizoid affective disorder bipolar, which basically means she had both the experience of being bipolar coupled with the delusions that are often associated with schizophrenia. And that my father, among other challenges in his life, his depression manifested like a lot of men for that generation with excessive drinking. And so the part of the result was that we grew up, and I have 6 siblings, we grew up financially insecure, food insecure, really challenged. And I want to be clear, we were identified and racialized as white, so we had more privilege than other Americans. But nevertheless, we still suffered from a kind of poverty that made every decision fraught with tension. And there was an extreme amount of violence in my household. Um, I would be regularly beaten. Um, and the world outside was also a dangerous place. We lived in a community that had a lot of crime, and I and my siblings were often subject to beatings outside the house as well. So, how did that affect me? How does that sort of shape me? How did those subroutines, as I call them in the book, show up today? Well, one of the clearest ways for me is what I refer to as a kind of hypervigilance. When a child grows up in an insecure environment where their sense of self safety, their sense of being loved, their sense of belonging is either conditioned by their own behavior. You better behave, otherwise I won't love you. Or in combination with a difficult unpredictability of things like mental illness. I never knew what the evening would be like when my father got home from work. I never knew what what delusional statement my mother would make. Standing there in the corner talking to the recently assassinated Bobby Kennedy, for example, and me looking around, going, "There's nobody in the room. Who's she talking to?" Because of that, I developed this hyper awareness, this hypersensitivity to how people are behaving, and it was a pursuit of safety. Now, in my early 20s, I became a reporter. And one of the skill sets of a good reporter is the ability to interview people. And if you think about the application of hypersensitivity, hypervigilance to the interview process, you and I are having a conversation, but there's another part of my body that's actually quite aware of how you're feeling. Right now, in this moment, like I'm noticing that you're probably sitting on a floor, maybe on a cushion. I'm imagining it's late in the evening there. I'm imagining you might have family all around you, right? There's this whole structure that my brain is tracking even as we're talking. The positive aspect of that is that you can feel extremely well listened to. You can feel that I am hyper present. And you said before that you started to feel really calm just talking. That's me taking that superpower and turning it into something positive, as opposed to, say, a source of persistent, constant anxiety, which it has been for me at times in my life. Long-winded, but you see the point I'm making.
Yeah. Thank you, Jerry. Jerry, in fact, that was one of the things that I wanted to double click on, because this is what you have mentioned on page number 17, I guess. Let me just read it for you. You have mentioned dad was a good man whose broken heart sometimes led him to drink to drunkenness. Mom was a good woman whose broken childhood led to a mental illness that further led her to hear and see things that, as often as not, were not there. Just curious, how is that possible that one gets to see and hear things based on the past that one is grown up in? That's first question. And the second question is, when you realized, when you developed that insight that this could be the influence of the past, how did it transform your relationship with both your father and mother?
Great questions, both of them. So, I gave a biological, clinical definition of my mother's mental illness before, and one of the things about biologically based mental illness is that it's hard to discern where the biology ends and the psychology begins, right? And so while this isn't always the case, my mother, and we knew this because she would talk about it, my mother experienced extreme boundary violations. She herself was uh, sexually abused as a girl. And we never knew quite the whole truth of it, but which was very disturbing as a child, right? You hear a story and it's like, is that true? I don't understand. Where's the ground of this? As I became an adult, I came to understand that truth is a slippery thing. And what I could know to be true was that those were her feelings. Now, one of the ways that a child processes uh, the abuse of boundary violations may be to split off in certain structures of the psyche and to create little safe zones that they can exist in. Psychologists might refer to this as disassociation. Um, and one of the things that can happen, it doesn't always happen, but it can happen, is that the child starts to make stories up in order to make sense of what is so painful. Later on in the book, I talk about making stories to make sensible of the insensible things. I cannot make sense of this, so I'm going to create a story. And by the way, this is a very human condition. It's one of the roots of all our mythologies. We try to explain the world by creating a story.
Precisely.
So part of what happened from my mother was her mind split off and started creating all sorts of scenarios, some of which were true, some of which were not objectively true, but true enough to create the feelings. That is one of the ways in which the ghosts of the past show up in the present. But that's not the only way. You know, as I described before about my hypervigilance, one of the other adaptations that children who suffer adverse childhood experiences create is sets of rules, right? So a rule might be you have to eat all the food on your plate before you go to bed, right? And psychologists will say that that can be the root of being overweight, eating past the point of being full, right? That's a simplistic expression of what I was talking about before. And so you asked finally, you know, when did I start to become aware of this? Well, it was through my own psychoanalysis. You know, you described this book as sort of moving to you. Understand that so much of the perspective that I give, that I carry, it's actually rooted in having been in psychoanalysis for almost 30 years. And one of the most important lessons that I learned, and I repeat this line from Carl Jung in the book, which is this: until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate.
Absolutely. Such a beautiful quote this is by Carl Jung, and I often share that in
Yeah.
my programs. Yeah. You know, no doubt, you have mentioned in your book that what we don't sort things impedes our happiness, tricks us into using the rest of our lives. And I loved it when you said that when things don't make sense, in order to make sense, we create stories. Now, how can one develop an insight or awareness for self or others that what you're manifesting outside is a self-scripted story which is only causing suffering for self and others?
Well, I'll take you back to the conversation we had a few minutes ago about the power of that question, how are you? Right. And what I refer to in the book as radical self-inquiry. You cannot begin the process of stopping the outward effects of those inward unconscious belief systems until you first are willing to stand still and look at your own self. You have to pause and say, wait, I'm about to lose my temper. Why? Oh, I'm afraid. What am I afraid of? Oh, I believe there's a threat here, but there isn't really a threat, right? You know, your question talked about the way our inner structures create an outer reality, if you will. And I'm not talking about magical manifestation, right? If I believe in happiness, money will rain down from the sky. Okay. What I'm talking about is the outward conditions that we spend a lot of time complaining about and not really recognizing that we have played a role, not entirely responsible, but we have played a role in the maintenance of those systems. And then the last piece on this, I would say, is I think it's critically important that leaders, this is where the book is really focused at business leaders or leaders in general, that leaders, those who hold power, do this work. Because not only do they create outward misery for themselves, but because of the nature of their power, they create outward misery for those around them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so much with you on this, Jerry, because I personally do a lot of work with leaders, whether in the business world or in the corporate world. And when I apply the same or similar principles with leaders, I personally feel they don't open up so early and so easily.
Mm.
Why do you think people take a lot of time to share what they are going through? And there's a huge concrete wall that they have created for themselves between work and life,
Which is
which I,
false
which I don't understand.
because it's unsafe. Because as children, and I'm going to imagine a world. I'm going to imagine that the people that you're talking about, the people you're visualizing, are for the most part identified as men. Is that right?
Yes.
So if we think about the way we socialize boys to compartmentalize their life, right? Feelings go in one box, and the only acceptable set of feelings are either happiness or anger. Anything in between is too nuanced, and we can't feel that. So there's no grief, there's no sadness, there's no space for those feelings. And then there's our output. We measure worthiness by whether or not you got good grades in school, whether or not you got into the right school, whether or not you got the right job, whether or not you have enough money, whether or not you have more money, whether or not you have more toys than anybody else, right? And we live this bifurcated, compartmentalized, disassociative life. And then we give that person power. And we say to them, coaches like you, coaches like me, coaches like Brene Brown will say, be authentic, be vulnerable. And the little boy in them says, I'll be damned. That's too dangerous.
Hmm.
Because when I was a little boy and I fell down and scraped my knee, my father came up to me and said, I'll give you something to cry about. You're going to cry? Man up. Stand up.
Be a man.
Be a man.
Boys don't
And
cry.
we boys don't cry.
Hmm.
Boy, and you know what happens, my friend? You give that person, we were talking about business leaders, I'm going to extend it to community leaders, I'm going to extend it to political leaders for it. You give that person power, and they are with suffering. Suffering is all around us. All of our teachers teach us that. Suffering is a part of life.
Hmm.
And they have not internalized what to do with suffering. So they scapegoat people. oh, it's this religious sector, not that. It's not us, it's them. Or it's that other country that's the problem. And you give them enough power without any governors on this, without any training on what to do with pain and suffering, and you get war. You get violence. You get demonization of human beings. All because I fell down and some older man said, be a man.
I'm just listening to you. What I'm listening is it's extremely important to have that radical inquiry and check where is it coming from? Where is this response or reaction coming from? If I'm feeling angry, where is that coming from? And going deeper and deeper and a further layer down. You know, in your book, what caught my attention is you mentioned that pursuit of leadership requires pursuit of growing up. What does that mean when you mentioned growing up here?
So that's me being a little cheeky and noting that despite chronological age, we have many, many, many people who hold power who are children. I often visualize them as little boys and girls in adult clothing with their overly large sleeves flapping around as they struggle to make decisions. And because they feel at a loss, they don't feel grounded, they mask all the feelings with aggression. It's your fault. Why didn't you pick? Right. So, what I'm trying to convey is that the process of being a true leader is a process of becoming the fully actualized adult that you were born to be. Because full adulthood, you know, if we think about the elders in our lives, and we think about those who hold the preciousness, the precious container of our communities, whether it's our religious institutions, our political institutions, our businesses, there is a groundedness about them. There's a beautiful word, Latin root, gravitas. It means I'm leading, if you will, from my solar plexus, not from my prefrontal cortex, my forehead, not from the back of my throat where I'm tight and scared, but leading from the seat of my soul, divine spot, if you will. And every now and then, there are a few of us who are graced with encountering elders. And the thing that I've always noticed about the elders is that they laugh more than they cry. They laugh at our absurd, flailing arms, trying to be grown up, and it's okay. In my book, I tell the story of meeting Pema Chodron, the Buddhist nun, the American Buddhist nun. And I remember, and I tell the story of listening to her teach on the nature of impermanence and being just rocked by this. You know, there was a great line she said, you know, and the thing is about impermanence is once you think you understand it, you've now slipped grounded beneath the definition. And of course, that's falling apart all the time as well. And I shouted out, well, that's not fair, right? I wanted the definitive answer to what is impermanence. Anyway, when I went to see her, I knelt it in front of her and I was just a mess. I was just crying, crying, crying. And she just tapped my arm very, very gently. And she said, honey, you think you're open. You just got to keep opening. That was an elder moment. That was encountering a being who had done their work. That was encountering a fully actualized adult.
And how can we draw this parallel in the corporate world? Because wouldn't that be considered as a sign of weakness? Also, because in your book, somewhere you have drawn a connection between vulnerability and grace. Tell me more
Okay,
about
so
that.
yeah, I'll give you an example that I often cite. Um, few years back, I had a client who had been in the process of fundraising for their startup. And the potential investor at the last minute pulled the term sheet, basically said no to the funding. And my client, in a complete freaked out moment, called me up and said, I don't know what to do. I don't know what am I going to say to the team. I promised them that we're going to be fundraising. And I said, well, he said, what do I tell them? I said, well, how about the truth? Oh, no. I can't tell them the truth. If I tell them the truth, they're all going to leave. I said, well, would you rather they stay for a lot? So he said, well, how do I tell them the truth? I said, well, that's an interesting question. Now you could lean in and say, I want to tell you, I'm completely freaked out here. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I still want you to continue working. I said, that's actually not fair. That's you being aware of your feelings, but asking other people to take care of your anxiety and your fear. I said, so the vulnerable, authentic, two words that I tend not to use, by the way, the real truth telling leader might say something like this. This is hard news. I'm not 100% sure how we're going to recover from this. But I want you to understand something. I believe in our mission. I believe in this team. And in this difficult moment, there's not a person I'd rather have around me than you people. So let's try to do what we can. We're trying to do the impossible anyway. We're trying to launch a business. Let's hang together and see where we go from here. Now, there's a PS to that story, which is when my client did some version of that, the employee base voluntarily took a pay cut to hold off until they could finally raise the money. That's what I'm talking about when I say being real, telling the truth, taking responsibility for your own feelings, and creating the conditions for your employees to be their best selves. People want.
And if my understanding is right, this is what you mentioned when you said for today's leader, it's not important to know what to do. What is really important is to focus on why and who they are. Is my understanding right?
Yes, and I'll add one thing to that. The trying to understand what to do changes every day because the conditions in which we operate change every day. You go to work one day and the competitive landscape looks one way. And by the end of the day, the competitive landscape looks another way. You go to work one day and you think you have the customers that you have. And then at the end of the day, you have a different set of customers. That's the reality of the business. That's the impermanence applied to our businesses. So all of this focus on how do I do this? How do I do that? How do I do that? It's useful, but ultimately it's limited because I can lay out for a client, do this, do this, do this. But then they have to be able to withstand the conditions that arise every single day. See, the goal of any good coaching relationship is that the client doesn't need you. Right? Just like the goal of any parenting is that the child no longer needs you because they've internalized you. They know what to do because they know who they are. They know what their values are. And those values will guide you much more than that. Do these 5 things and everything will be fine.
Yeah. And, with so much of ease you mentioned, you realize who you are. They've internalized you. They are aware of their values. I personally feel it's a lifetime journey. And that brings me to a question. Jerry, you have been a professional, right? From being a professional to a founder, to an investor, to someone who understands life and human behavior so well. How has that been a journey for you? I mean, When did you realize, or what did you notice about yourself, about the values that drove all these shifts and changes for you?
I'll say this, the last line before the afterword of my book is, and with that, I mastered the art of growing up. Um, Two things I would say there. One, it's an art, not a science. And the second, it's to point out that I did not write, and with that, I grew up. Because I agree with you, it's a lifelong practice. Before we started recording, when we were checking in with each other, I mentioned that I'm working on my next book. And I said, just sort of casually, yeah, and it kind of kicked my butt. It's kicking my butt again. This is a weekend where I spent some time embodying my father, which is in a much deeper way than I did in the reboot. Um, I think that I can't I can't tell you the moment when I realized this is the journey, but I can tell you the moment or a moment when I realized that I may have crossed a Rubicon, meaning for the most part, I'm better. For the most part, I'm happy. And I was crossing a street. I was at an intersection going for dinner with my Buddhist teacher, Sharon Salzberg. And we're chatting back and forth, waiting for the light to change so we could cross the street. And she looked at me and she said, "You know, Jerry, the thing about you right now is you're happy." And I said, "Well, I might as well be. I've been sitting on the meditation cushion for 16 years. What do you think is going to happen? Isn't that the point of it all?" Um, and what I meant was there is a moment in time when the practice of growing up, the art of growing up, starts to have a consistent, persistent payoff. It doesn't mean I'm always grounded. It doesn't mean that I'm always my highest and best self. It just means that um, when I lose my sense of self, I can, as my teacher Sharon likes to say, begin again. I can come back to myself. And if we think about the practice of meditation, in my tradition, what we're taught is come back to your breath. There's a teaching from the Buddha, which I'm going to mangle it, but he says, in effect, better to have spent uh, a lifetime uh, of a kind of wandering, only to wake up in the last moment to the reality of life. And there's such a beautiful gift in that, because what the Buddha taught was that we practice, knowing full well that we will fail, and that the goal is to wake up before you die. What a relief. And
Absolutely.
isn't it the opposite? It's the opposite of what we were learned in school, right? Which is work really hard to get that great grade.
Yeah.
No, begin again every day.
This reminds me, the other day I was listening to one of the mindfulness teachers, Jonathan, and he mentioned in his talk the only two categories of people who are extremely happy by making a fool of themselves. The first ones are comedians, the second one are mindfulness teachers.
Mhm.
You know, as you're talking about making time for yourself and starting again, also you mentioned about radical inquiry, where you spoke about it's important to take a pause and reflect deep within. In today's world where we live in, people take rather pride in saying that I'm a workaholic.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, work can definitely give you meaning, but at the same time, work can be a means to your suffering as well. Now, what do you think? What drives that behavior in people when they take pride in saying that I'm a workaholic?
Well, I think that what they're doing is they're mistaking motion for meaning. Uh, Now, to be clear, sometimes in the pursuit of something really, really important, we work hard, right? I'm working on the new book most weekends. You could argue, well, Jerry, that means you're working every day. That's true. It means I am doing something that produces joy and uh, and expands my heart and expands my head every day. But I'm not stressed every day. I'm not struggling for a sense of self approbation or the admiration of the world every day, right? Um, and I think that part of what's happened in our modern society is that we have replaced the notion of self worth with the notion of busyness. We derive what little self worth we carry from being able to answer the question, how are you? Oh, I'm so busy. I am so busy. My God, I'm so busy. Why are you so busy? Do you like it? Are you doing things right? In contrast, I feel my life is quite full, right? I have 40 clients. I am the CEO of a company. I'm working on a new book. I'm a father of 3 adult children. I'm a life partner to a beautiful woman. We own a farm. Our life is filled and rich. And I went for a bike ride for 2 hours yesterday. And I talked to a couple of friends, and I talked to my son, and I talked to my partner, and I watched some goofy television show, and I read a book. Right? Ease, gentleness, joy, happiness. So I think the root of that busyness is emptiness.
Let me just absorb this. The root of that busyness is emptiness. Hmm.
Sure. Well, the Buddha taught the notion of hungry ghosts. It's a beautiful image of wraith like figures who are insatiable and they barely occupy their selves, they barely occupy their bodies. Um, and what you see in Hungry Ghost behavior is it's a powerful poem called The Tyranny of More. More toys, more things, more work, more approbation, more adulation, more, more than I could possibly need, more money than I can possibly spend so that I could do what? Ward off these negative self feelings, ward off feelings that I'm not lovable,
Hmm.
I'll never be safe,
Hmm.
and there's no place I belong.
Yeah, yeah. Jerry, interestingly, you work in the startup ecosystem, right? You have been an investor, you have been a founder. And if you look at that ecosystem, people are evaluated based on the funding that you've been able to raise, the kind of evaluation that you have for the organization that you have created. 3 years, and the evaluation is already $500 million. 2 years, the evaluation is already $200 million. 8 years, it's already a unicorn. What do you think? Where's the connection between what we are talking about right now, the grounding, radical self inquiry, and the way the society describes success in terms of the evaluation, in terms of the money that you have in your pocket, the car that you drive? Where's the connection?
Well, I think you're drawing an important implication and connection with your question. So let's go back to the context that you set up. Valuing people's work and describing it as successful because a company raises larger and larger funds at higher and higher valuations. So let's poke at the fallacy of that for a moment. And I speak as an investor who's invested in a lot of those companies. Okay. Do we know of any highly valued, capitalized companies that are publicly traded that are for shit? Of course we don't. We know plenty of companies that whose valuations are 10, 20, 30, 100 times more than they should be, right? Do we know of any highly valuable, highly productive, good companies that create good product, good work environments that are undervalued? Of course we do. We can see those all the time. And that's one of the values of looking at the public market is that, wait, we can see a dissonance here. And if we probe hard enough, we can see that oftentimes a company's valuation is disconnected from the reality of the business, positively and negatively. Why? Because stock investors, public investors, make money on the movement of stock. Very, very few people take a Warren Buffett attitude of, I like Geico Insurance, so I'm going to buy as much of it as I can. Or I drink Coke every day, so I'm going to buy as much Coke as I can. Very, very few investors take that attitude. Now, when we take that knowledge and we apply it to the private equity world, to the private market world, somehow we lose sight of that dissonant reality. Somehow we think that a $500 million company or a company valued at $500 million in its last round is better than a company that was valued at $300 million in its last round. Why? Because that first piece of work that needs to be done, which is how are you measuring success? Right? I have a private little company. Reboot is a small little company. I don't know how much we're valued. I know that we're profitable. I know that we pay really good salary. I know that everybody who works for us, for the most part, is happy and does a good living and is able to buy themselves homes and is able to do that is success to me. So one of the first things that I and my colleagues would do going into a company is to say, let's describe what success is. Let's define what we are striving to achieve. And from that place, let's create OKRs that measure the things that we want to measure. And pay no attention to unicorn status.
Yeah.
It's an absurd notion.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And here's the last question. Before we close this beautiful conversation, Jerry, I'm just loving it. I'm just being mindful of your time. You know, in your book, you mentioned the Gospel of Saint Thomas. It says, if you bring forth what is in you will save you. If you do not bring forth what is in you will destroy you.
Amen. Yeah, so Saint Thomas, so in Christianity in the New Testament, the Gospel of Saint Thomas is not included in the standard definitions of the New Testament. He's considered one of the Gnostic Gospels, one of the kind of radical, rebellious Gospels, and his is considered one of the radical Gospels. And so it's important to note that about that quote, that this is a bit of an outsider looking in. But more importantly, I think what he spoke to was that which lies unexamined inside of ourselves, that which lies unworked with within ourselves, has the capacity to create all sorts of trouble in our lives. You know, the Socratic version of this is the unexamined life is not worth living. I think it was Plato who said that, who was a Socrates student. It's that notion that which is unconscious can cause the most trouble. And the call, and this is sort of multicultural, the call is to look within to bring forth that which is the most troubling so that it can no longer trouble you. That's that freedom and liberation and the gravitas that we're looking for.
Yeah, thank you. I think what connected with me was the way you express yourself and how expression is really important. And I personally feel that connection, expression, and contribution are the three basic desires of a human soul. And reading this book just validated my belief on all these three: the expression, connection, and contribution. Thank you so much, Jerry, for your generosity in sharing everything that you have shared in the last 40 minutes and, of course, in your book. So thank you so much for your time. Look forward to
Well,
interact with you again.
thank you for having me on the show, and it was a delight getting to know you. And thank you for the kind words about the book. And may you and your family be safe and happy.
Thank you.